Morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Good. I'm not objecting to this view that we've got with the spotlighting now, but I will say that I cannot see who's making the objections most of the time. So if you can assist me with that.
I see. I'm referring. I'll refer to my team. I frankly I don't know how the all of this
I
works on
just mean that if somebody objects and it's not like obvious
obvious.
who it
Yeah. So
is.
maybe let's all keep that in mind going
Yeah.
forward.
I've been doing this for 2 days, so it's kind of obvious to me who it is when it's obvious, but when
When it's
it's
a, yeah.
just,
No, I'm trying to think how to help you best, but maybe what I can ask is I will try to help, and then also my fine colleagues, the attorneys, if you can please identify yourself if it's um, it may not be clear to you whether you're on Zoom or not. So we're trying to
thank
use the
you.
spot. Thank you. We're trying to use the spotlight feature, my team in the background, so that the YouTube streaming is
Oh,
complete.
I understand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
I'm
just
not
explaining.
complaining, but
So,
it does make it difficult for me to identify who's
yes, I
talking. So
agree. I agree. Um, Great. And I'm just going to wait a few more seconds to make sure we've admitted everyone into the room. All right, I think everyone, well, no, I see there's one more. I'm going to wait just a little bit more. All right, it looks like everyone is now in the room who would like to be in the room. I will go ahead and get started and go on the record. Good morning, I'm Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is now the third day of Phase 1A of the hearing on the pending petitions of Consolidated Irrigation District, Fresno Irrigation District, and Alta Irrigation District, and Semi-Tropic Improvement District of Semi-Tropic Water Storage District to revoke or revise the declaration of fully appropriated stream systems with respect to the Kings River system on a potential revocation of water right licenses 11517 and 11521, and on a proposed cease and desist order against the Kings River Water Association and its member units. This hearing is being conducted by Zoom web conference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. If you are experiencing technical difficulties trying to communicate with us, if you have technical difficulties with Zoom, please send an email to the AHO at adminhrgoffice@waterboards.ca.gov, and we will be monitoring that email inbox. Assisting me today are several staff of the Administrative Hearings Office. We have Nicole Mullen, Amy Blunk, Kyle Wooldridge, and Megan Nyes. Ms. Mullen will once again be handling the screen sharing of exhibits and moving along the slides. So if you're a witness testifying and you have a slide presentation, you may simply ask Ms. Mullen to proceed to the next slide. And for the attorneys, as we have done, you may ask Ms. Mullen directly to pull up those exhibits. And I think we can all agree she's done a fine job considering. If at any time I am experiencing technical difficulties during this hearing, and I'm glad I made a note yesterday because I did for a few minutes, and I'm not able to rejoin the Zoom conference fairly quickly, one of my staff will call a recess until I'm able to rejoin you. I think we handled that well yesterday. Thank you for the suggestion to have our fine court reporter read back the transcript when I was cut out for a few minutes. We will once again take breaks today. We'll have a mid-morning break as usual and lunch as we have done. Once again, I'm planning a hard stop at 5 p.m. and ideally we'll break a little before then when there is a convenient time. I am also going to carry over, as I did yesterday, the appearances made on June 2nd. But I do want to ask if there's anyone else appearing today who has not already identified themselves for the record, representing any of the parties today. Okay, let's move on. What I see as the agenda for this morning will be first offering KRWA's exhibits into evidence. We left that from yesterday. Next, addressing Semi-Tropics cross-examination exhibits that were introduced yesterday. Third, I want to return to the motion to exclude Terra Nova's witnesses. I look forward to hearing about that conversation. And then finally, we'll move to the Upper River District's case in chief. Does anyone have anything to add for that morning agenda? Then we'll move to offering KRWA's exhibits into the evidentiary record. Mr. Herr, would you like to offer KRWA's exhibits 1 through 37 into the evidentiary record for phase 1A?
Yes. Yes, please.
And then, as I did before with Semitropics exhibits, I'm going to identify the exclusions and we'll move through objections. So I have excluded it. Well, let me identify. In accordance with my ruling of June 1st, I excluded the proposed written testimony that is found in KRWA 9 and KRWA 10. And then associated with that, I'm also going to exclude KRWA 4 and 5, which are the resumes of the witnesses associated with that testimony. I think we'll just keep the record clean. Mr. Herr, do you have any concerns with that?
No, thank you.
Thank you. And then moving on, I have an objection to KRWA 7, paragraphs 39 through 46 from Semitropic. And that, I took a look at that, and that also appears to me irrelevant. That's, I believe, Mr. Johansson's testimony, KRWA 7. And that appears irrelevant based on my June 1st ruling that addresses Sigma and Sigma compliance and implementation. And I don't believe Mr. Johansson testified on those issues yesterday. Mr. Herr, do you have any concerns with that exclusion?
No, I think you have accurately reflected my recollection as to what we discussed yesterday.
And then following along with KRWA 8, that's Mr. Merritt's testimony. Similarly, we had a discussion yesterday and I believe agreed, we'll say agreed loosely, I excluded paragraphs 7 through 36 of his proposed written testimony, as we discussed yesterday. Mr. Herr, does that seem accurate to you?
Yes, that's consistent with my recollection. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I also have an objection, I believe, from Semitropic on KRWA 17, and then KRWA 28 through 32. These are documents that describe Semitropic's project, and I believe in accordance, it would follow along with my June 1st ruling to exclude those exhibits as outside of the scope of phase 1A. Mr. Herr, do you have any concerns or response to that exclusion?
No, I understand and concur with your thoughts on those, on 7 through 36 and map 17.
Map 17, and then also KRWA 28 through 32.
Right, yes, I'm sorry, and 28 through 32.
Thank you. And then with that, I believe, and Mr. O'Brien or Mr. Bivens can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the only outstanding objection is KRWA 37. I'll look to the two of you. Does that objection to KRWA 37 still stand?
Yes, Ms. Kenzie, the objection to KRWA 37 still stands and the related objection as well, I think, to the KRWA 13 summary of revised reporting, which necessarily depends on KRWA 37. I think it would make sense to reserve those objections and reserve arguments on those objections until after we get done with rebuttal testimony.
Okay.
And then I have.
Oh, and you have so, well, let's pause there. Mr. Herr, do you have any concerns if we reserve the objections to KRWA 37 and 13 until after rebuttal?
No, I think Mr. Bivens has a good proposal and I concur.
Okay, we'll do that. And then Mr. Bivens, were there additional objections that you wanted to raise?
Yes, I have one more with respect to Dave Merritt, and I want to make clear that Mr. O'Brien and I are continuing our objection from yesterday to the surprise testimony that went well beyond the scope of his written testimony with respect to the model issue we've been discussing, and particularly to the surprise testimony that was elicited by Mr. Jacobs on Friendly Cross, and that was then used to revive an objection that you'd previously overruled to Dr. Tagabi's testimony. So we'd submit that all of that testimony should be, all of that oral testimony should be excluded. However, to the extent you continue to allow that testimony to remain in the record, we'd like the opportunity to take you up on your suggestion from yesterday to submit some supplemental rebuttal testimony from Dr. Tagavi, which I think is going to be necessary to resolve the pending motion to strike from KRWA and the Upper River districts, because what we've seen is that motion is really based on a factual issue. We're going to need to hear more facts from Dr. Tagavi about his limited reliance on the model and the circumstances of the development and use of the model and its reliability. And I'd be happy to make an offer of proof with respect to what Dr. Tagavi's supplemental rebuttal testimony would look like, because I really think, when he does file that, it will show, returning to the word that Mr. O'Brien used yesterday, the audacity of this motion strike.
That's helpful, Mr. Bivens. So I'm thinking this through. First of all, your objection is noted for the record with respect to Mr. Merritt's testimony on cross-examination from yesterday. I am going to continue to overrule that objection and maintain that testimony in the record. However, I'm thinking through this issue of Dr. Tagavi's testimony and reliance on the model and the pending motion to strike. And I wonder if similarly, it makes sense to address that motion after you've had a chance, after rebuttal, after you've had a chance to offer additional evidence with respect to the model and Dr. Tagavi's reliance on the model. From your perspective, would it make sense to address the motion to strike after we've heard rebuttal, as you suggested for KRWA 37 and 13?
It would, and I would also suggest that it probably makes sense to take the briefing schedule we discussed yesterday off calendar and just proceed with supplemental rebuttal testimony from Dr. Tagavi. And then after that, I think we can pretty easily address Mr. Jacobs' motion to strike. I will say that I'd also like to reserve the right after that rebuttal testimony is submitted and in connection with the rebuttal to have another opportunity to conduct a meaningful cross-examination of Mr. Merritt.
I wholeheartedly object to all of that. We have a briefing schedule in place from yesterday. Supplemental rebuttal is not something contemplated in any of the administrative hearing officer's orders. And, if they're going to get supplemental rebuttal, we should get so too. I'm not sure what would come out on rebuttal that would address Mr. Merritt's testimony. The rebuttal testimony has already been submitted weeks ago. So, I thought that the hearing officer's offer to allow attorneys to brief their objection was very generous, and we've accepted that. If the hearing officer intends to grant a request for additional testimony, I respectfully request to be able to do the same and to submit new witnesses that will talk about the model.
Well, I think the problem here, Ms. Kenzie, is that Mr. Jacobs has already offered supplemental rebuttal testimony. He did it through a friendly cross with Mr. Merritt yesterday. So I would object to further supplemental testimony on an issue that is a really, really questionable relevance given the very limited reliance, Dr. Tagavi, on that model.
Let me ask, are there any comments from any of the other parties, Mr. Herr, or any of your colleagues or any other parties on the issue of whether or not to allow supplemental rebuttal with respect to Dr. Tagavi's testimony and the model that we've been discussing that was to some extent relied upon in his testimony?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Kenzie. This is Leonard Herr for KRWA. A couple of thoughts. I think Semi-Tropics attorneys know what Dave Merritt's testimony is in general concerning this model. So they certainly have an opportunity during the rebuttal phase of this case, I think, to deal with that. Second, I agree with Mr. Jacobs that we have a briefing schedule, and I would suggest that to the extent Semi-Tropics has an offer of proof, in addition to the legal authority that they wish to present, that they simply do so consistent with this briefing schedule. And then at that point in time, Ms. Kenzie, I think you have more information in order to assess the situation. From my perspective, we have an issue which is similar in sort of the trial court setting of a 402 hearing in state court as to the material this expert has relied upon. Or if we borrow from the federal rules, it's analogous to a Kelly Fry type situation. So I really think in fairness to the hearing office and its staff, that Semi-Tropic should simply come up with the legal authority, make an offer of proof, to which I intend to respond within the time constraints we've already agreed upon. And then your office can look at this and decide how best to go after that. So those are kind of my thoughts. The only other thing I want to bring up, Ms. Kenzie, is I do have a couple of additional exhibits, exhibits 40 and 41. 41 is basically KRCD's letter to Semi-Tropic concerning this model. And so I don't know how we're going to deal with these. These are documents that I intend to use, and I'm not sure how to do that. If I'm just going to bring them up during later phases of the case, as Semi-Tropic has done. But the other exhibit, Exhibit 40, is part of the administrative record, and so I'm a little unclear as to whether that's already part of the record. I have culled it out. It's a letter dated June 9, 2014 from the Water Board to my client with the final report that Mr. Bivens referred to the draft of yesterday. So I don't mean to be long-winded, but I wanted to give you, Ms. Kenzie, sort of my overview of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's, we'll return to the bigger question in a moment. I want to make sure I understand about KRWA 40 and 41. These are exhibits that were not submitted and identified on May 3rd, but that you intend to raise. Is it on cross-examination of other witnesses, or is this is additional? I understand you identified one as already being in the administrative record, but can you clarify for me when these, whether they came in on May 3rd or whether they came in at some other time?
Well, I don't, is the administrative record in evidence?
It is not yet in evidence. I think it's a good question how we're going to handle that. No, I think the way, I mean, these are documents that I think we could take official notice of, and so I would, they're fairly simple to move into evidence, but let's assume those documents in the administrative record are not in evidence. I was going to consider whether the board, sort of en masse near the end of this proceeding, would move. And maybe that's the way we should do it now that I'm thinking out loud. Let's do this. Let's, before the close of this proceeding, so after, on June 18th, prior to that, if the parties would please identify documents from the administrative record that have not already been introduced explicitly into the evidentiary record that you want to make sure is moved into the evidentiary record. I think that's the cleanest way to handle it. That way we can give them exhibit numbers. We'll call them something appropriate, and we can refer to them going forward. Are there any, does that make sense?
Ms. Kenzie, this is Leonard Herr. The two documents that I'm referring to, one is the letter from the board dated June 9, 2014, plus the final report. And the reason I'm introducing this final report and the transmittal letter is because of a document that Semi-Tropic brought up and cross-examined KRW on yesterday, which was a draft of this report. So that's that document. The other document is a letter from KRCD concerning this model that has become the subject of controversy with Dr. Tagavi. And I don't know offhand if this letter is part of the administrative record. So one is for sure, the other one, I don't know.
What I'd like to have you do, I think is what is cleanest is to submit those with your rebuttal. I think both of those exhibits came up as a result of cross-examination during this case in chief phase. And I think the appropriate place to deal with those would be in rebuttal. So can we reserve those for when we hear any rebuttal from KRWA?
Yes, that looks good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And
Now,
I'm sorry, I'll just say,
Yeah.
just with respect to Mr. Herr's discussion of the briefing schedule, I
Sure.
don't think we're going to get a lot out of legal briefing on what is a motion based on factual issues. I will say, however, that I'm prepared to make an offer of proof here on the record today as to what Dr. Tagabi would testify about in supplemental rebuttal.
Great, let's do that.
All right, so Dr. Tagabi will be testifying generally to the development, uses, and public availability of the Kings Basin Integrated Groundwater and Surface Water Model, which is different from the IWFM model that Mr. Merritt mentioned yesterday. Specifically, Dr. Tagabi will testify that the IGSM model was developed by a number of lead agencies, including the Kings River Conservation District, for whom Mr. Merritt works, and the Upper Kings Water Forum, in conjunction with DWR. And I'll note that several of Mr. Jacobs' clients represented on the Upper Kings Water Forum was funded by the Upper Kings Water Forum, the city of Fresno, and by DWR with public funds. The development and calibration of the model, and the calibration was completed, by the way, was overseen by a technical committee composed of a number of witnesses who've been offered by opposing counsel in this matter, including Gary Serrato, formerly of Fresno Irrigation District, Phil Desitoff of Consolidated Irrigation District, Mr. Haugen, and Lynn Garver of the Kings River Conservation District. Again, the model, Dr. Tagabi will testify that the model was successfully completed and calibrated, and a final report, which we'll submit as an exhibit to his supplemental rebuttal, was submitted directly to KRCD in 2007. And since the model was completed in 2007, it's been used in connection with multiple projects, including studies performed by Consolidated Irrigation District and Fresno Irrigation District. And finally, Dr. Tagabi will testify that the model is publicly available upon request from DWR. And he will reiterate, to the extent it's helpful and necessary, that his opinions are based not on the model, but on the water master reports, which have been available to all parties to this proceeding, and that the model was solely used to help him develop his conclusion about the amount of losses attributable to seepage discussed in one paragraph of his testimony, paragraph 16.
Ms. Kenzie, may I reply?
Yes, please.
I would like to offer supplemental rebuttal directly to the contrary. I can offer supplemental rebuttal that the model was paid for handsomely by my clients and eventually never completed, couldn't be calibrated, and Dr. Tagabi was let go from the project. You heard Mr. Merritt testify yesterday that the model hasn't been used, is on the shelf, and my clients will testify to the fact that they became uncomfortable because the model could not calibrate. That's why they don't use it.
So thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Herr, do you have anything to add? I know I think I understand your position, but do you have anything to add?
No, and I think I spoke more to a process.
Yes.
I'm happy to add more facts as an offer of proof if we're going to go down that road. The letter from KRCD specifically, clearly, unequivocally indicates problems with the model. This was sent to Semi-Tropic in July of 2018 before the work of Dr. Tagabi in this case, so they certainly knew KRCD's problems prior to Dr. Tagabi. Second, Steve Haugen, the water master, was involved in the development of this project and is aware of whether this model was ever used, and if called to testify, he would say the model never was successfully completed and there were calibration problems with it.
So this is my, thank you. This is what I would propose, and then you all can tell me what you think about it, which I appreciate. I'd like to hear the supplemental testimony from all parties on this issue. I think it is important. On the one hand, this is a preliminary proceeding. So I think the standards, as I noted in my ruling, the normal evidentiary processes and normal evidentiary rules, even for administrative proceedings, don't necessarily apply. On the other hand, I think this is work that likely will assist us as we move into a later phase or phases of this proceeding, and that we can cover some ground here. I would like to hear the additional testimony and take up both of your offers on this issue. In terms of scheduling, what I'm thinking it makes sense to do is schedule this as a separate issue, sort of apart from rebuttal, that we would address first on June 17th. We have set aside June 17th, starting at 1 o'clock for a half day of hearing. And I would think that it may make sense to hear from Dr. Tagavi and the other witnesses that KRWA or the Upper River districts may have with respect to the model, the admissibility of the model, and then also generally going to the weight that should be afforded the model if that the model and its, not the model itself, which hasn't been introduced, but the testimony that relies on the model is admitted into the record. Let me start with Mr. Bivens. What is your response? And I should add to that, I'd be inclined to take the briefing schedule off calendar because it seems to me it's extra work. I'd like to hear the testimony. And then if it's appropriate to have written briefing afterwards, we would do that. But I think we would want to just handle it orally on June 17th after, to be clear, handle the motion to strike Dr. Tagavi's testimony after hearing from the additional witnesses on June 17th. Mr. Bivens, do you have a response to that proposal?
Yes, let me see if I can take all of those points. I agree that we should take the briefing schedule off of the calendar. I agree that it makes sense to hear Dr. Tagavi's supplemental rebuttal testimony on the afternoon of June 17th. And I wouldn't object in concept, certainly, to hearing supplemental rebuttal testimony from another witness offered by the Upper River districts or KRWA. I would be concerned about getting into unduly cumulative evidence. So I hope we can put some bounds on the number of witnesses we're going to devote to this model issue. And then I do think it makes sense to take up the motion to strike Dr. Tagavi's testimony after that's been completed. I think it also makes sense after that's been completed to take up a motion from Semi-Tropic to strike the surprise testimony from Dave Merritt we heard yesterday on the grounds that it's incompetent expert evidence and based on hearsay. Did I miss anything, Ms. Kenzie?
I don't think so. I think, in fact, you articulated that more clearly than I did. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mr. Jacobs, and then I'll turn to Mr. Herr.
So I think 2 witnesses is what we would request.
Okay.
I would hope that I could get it to 1 witness. I'm going to have to ask somebody to do this and that I haven't talked to yet. So, and then I was, are we going to submit written testimony ahead of time? And if so, what's the date for that? Or?
No, I don't think so. We're going to do this live because I just don't think there's time. And frankly, unless you object to it, I don't think it's fair to you to submit written testimony. And I think we are all professionals and we can handle this on the fly. And that is my thinking is no written testimony.
That sounds good. Off the top of my head, I can think of 1 additional document. I believe there is an extensive critique that was prepared at the time the model was at issue. When the concerns were raised and when it was eventually shelved. So I can try and track that down. I'm going to try and track down the person who wrote it, and I'll do my best.
So the document that would be helpful to have in advance, the exhibit itself.
Okay.
And as Ms. Kenzie, we'll submit our exhibit that I referenced in my offer of proof in advance as well.
Thank you. Shall we do that by close of business on Monday? Is that reasonable? Oh, not Monday. I'm sorry. We have a whole week. Hold. Let me look at my calendar. I was thinking we were getting together next week, which we're not. how about close of business on Thursday, June 10th? To have supplemental rebuttal exhibits, not including written testimony, submitted to the AHO. I'm going to return to you, Mr. Jacobs, in a moment, but Mr. Bivens, does June 10th, do you have any objections to that or suggestions?
No objection.
Okay. Mr. Jacobs, did you have anything else? Do you have any concerns with June 10th or anything else to add to this procedural proposal we have going?
Nope, that sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Herr, is there anything you would like to add?
Just briefly, I intend to have Mr. Haugen and Mr. Merritt testify at this hearing. And just, for simplicity's sake, I could certainly ask Mr. Merritt to testify to everything he's previously testified to concerning the model, and this is up to Mr. Bivens, I guess, I will just rely on that, which will certainly short circuit things. And then finally, I just feel compelled to present some evidence concerning Mr. Merritt's competence, which has now become an issue in this hearing. So those are my thoughts, Ms. Kenzie. Thanks.
Yes, I think I appreciate having, what I take from that is Mr. Merritt will be available regardless and will be available for additional questions which may come up. And I appreciate making Mr. Merritt available.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Bivens, do you have any response?
Well, I would object to further surprise direct testimony from Mr. Merritt. I certainly agree he should be available on cross-examination.
I will note the objection. So that's what we'll do going forward. We're going to take the briefing schedule off calendar. We will hold, I don't know what we want to call it. It is kind of like a 402 hearing, but we will hear from Dr. Tagavi and additional supplemental witnesses on rebuttal from the parties on June 17th, the afternoon of June 17th, starting at 1 p.m. We will, we have a deadline of June 10th to submit any documents, exhibits that the parties would like to include as supplemental rebuttal related to this issue. And then afterwards, after we've heard that additional evidence and testimony, we will address the pending motion to strike Dr. Tagavi's testimony. And then it's not currently pending, but I'll give Semi-Tropic an opportunity to renew their motion to strike the testimony of Mr. Merritt.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think with that, I'm going to return to KRWA's exhibits and moving those, which we were in the middle of getting those into the record. What I have now is that we've excluded KRWA 4 and 5, 9 and 10, KRWA 7, paragraphs 39 through 46, KRWA 8, paragraphs 7 through 36, KRWA 17, 28, and 32. We are going to reserve.
Sorry, point of order, Ms. Kenzie.
Yes,
I
please.
thought I heard you say 28 and 32. I believe it was 28 through 32.
Correct, 28 through 32. Thank you. And then we are reserving a ruling on the admission of KRWA 37 and 13. So with the exception of 37 and 13, which we're not acting on at this time, the remainder of KRWA's exhibits, with the exclusions that I identified, are now accepted into the evidentiary record for phase 1A. Any concerns before I move to Semi-Tropic's cross-examination exhibits? With that, Mr. O'Brien or Mr. Yes, please.
Ms. Kenzie, and again, where do exhibits 40 and 41, the two exhibits I fall into this, is that being reserved until this upcoming hearing?
Yes, so here's what I'd like to do also on June 10th, and I will issue a written order so that we memorialize this. Let's set a deadline of June 10th for any supplemental rebuttal exhibits in general. If there are supplemental rebuttal exhibits that arose out of cross-examination, which couldn't have been anticipated. So please, when you submit those exhibits, if you can also include essentially an explanation as to why these exhibits were not submitted by the rebuttal exhibit deadline, and point to the testimony, the cross-examination testimony that they're arising out of. But I will set also a deadline of June 10th, the end of close of business on June 10th, to submit additional exhibits. And that's where I see exhibits KRWA 40 and 41 being submitted, and then we'll consider moving them into evidence with the rebuttal portion of the hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, Mr. Bivens, would you like to offer semi-tropic exhibits? What I have are 115 through 120 into the evidentiary record.
So moved.
Are there any objections to admitting those exhibits into the record? With that, semi-tropic exhibits 115 through 120 are accepted into the evidentiary record for phase 1A. I'd like to move at this point to the pending motions to exclude the proposed testimony of Terra Nova Ranch. And we left off with that yesterday, and I asked Mr. O'Brien and Mr. McLaughlin to have a conversation. And I look forward to hearing from, I'll start with Mr. O'Brien, whether you came to any conclusions or have a proposal for me this morning.
Yes, Mr. McLaughlin and I spoke last evening, and as a result of that conversation, we are going to withdraw our objections to the testimony of Mr. Cameron and Mr. Bashan.
Thank you. I think from there we are ready to move to the Upper River District's case in chief, unless there are any other procedural issues that any of you would like me to address at this point. All right, Mr. Jacobs, do you have an opening statement? This would be the time, please.
Sounds good, I do. I'll keep it brief. So good morning, and as a result of the evidentiary ruling Tuesday evening, the scope of my case in chief presentation in this matter has been significantly reduced. I think it's unfortunate that the important issues relating to SGMA compliance and water supply and quality protection for disadvantaged communities have been excluded from this phase of the proceedings. And as stated in our opening brief, this matter will have real world consequences and goes far beyond a theoretical paper analysis of water availability. That said, we intend to call two witnesses. We've already called our first witness, Mr. Hess. His testimony offers compelling firsthand analysis of the deficiencies in the semi-tropic complaint. Mr. Hess is not a paid consultant for my clients. He is an experienced engineer with the Enforcement Division who reviewed the semi-tropic complaint and explained in writing its deficiencies. He requested specific explanations and evidentiary support from Semi-Tropics Council, which was met with the equivalent of a shoulder shrug and a, hey, you've got this already. Our final witness is hydrologist Nick Bonsignor. Mr. Bonsignor will present his critique of the two water availability analyses prepared by West Yost. That testimony will demonstrate that Semi-Tropics analysis was riddled with errors that were only corrected after my clients had to hire Mr. Bonsignor to review and critique Ms. Boissevain's work. And even after correcting several of the errors, Mr. Bonsignor will explain the remaining flaws in the analysis. For instance, he will explain how the water availability analysis did not comply with the methodology requested by the State Water Board. And he will explain why presenting the water availability analysis as an average yield is not appropriate, and also point out the fact that the water availability analysis seems to totally ignore the fact that the Upper River districts have a senior water right application on file. And with that, I would like to call Mr. Bonsignor.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask my team if we can find and spotlight Mr. Bonsignor. There we go. Good morning. Mr. Bonsignor, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Please proceed, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Bonsignor. Can you please state your full name and spell your last name for the record?
Nicholas Bonsignor, first name Nicholas, last name B as in boy, Onsignore.
Please describe your educational background and summarize your relevant work experience.
I hold a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from University of the Pacific. I've been a registered civil engineer in California since 1985. Since 1998, I've been one of the principals of the engineering firm of Wagner and Bonsignor Consulting Civil Engineer. Much of my work deals with administration of California water rights, including preparation of water right applications and water availability analyses for state board staff to gain acceptance of applications and issue permits.
Ballpark, how many water availability analyses have you worked on in your career?
Many, 40, 50, I don't know, quite a few.
Okay. Can you please summarize the review and analysis that you did on behalf of the Upper River Districts and KRWA?
Sure. So we reviewed 2 water availability analyses reports that were prepared by West Yost in support of Semi-Tropics application 32815. And part of that review involved what we call doing an alternative analysis, trying to recreate what they did in an effort to understand what they did.
Okay. So Semi-Tropic presented an original water availability analysis that you critiqued, correct?
Yes.
And Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up Semi-Tropic Exhibit 42? All right. Could you scroll down a bit, please? Okay. Mr. Bonsignor, do you recognize this technical memorandum as the what we're going to call the original water availability analysis?
Yes.
Okay. So let's start with this one. You also critiqued the revised water availability analysis, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Can you please describe the methodology and conclusions that are in this analysis?
Sure. Very generally, this analysis looked at a 63-year period of record, 1955 to 2017, and it relied on the supply component of computed daily natural flow at Piedra. And then from that daily natural flow, the methodology deducted estimated losses in the system, and then deducted senior water rights. First, water rights held by statement holders downstream of Piedra, and then deducting some of KRWA's licensed water rights. Then after computing water available, the remaining water, it then assumed a rate of diversion by Semi-Tropic of 2200 CFS to come up with an estimated amount that they termed it could be used, but diverted by Semi-Tropic. And they determined that out of the 63-year period of record, water was available in 18 years and averaged about 18,500 acre feet.
Did you agree with the methodology and the conclusions reached in this water availability analysis?
No.
Can you please explain why not?
So the original analysis had some deficiencies we identified, the most prominent of which two of KRWA's licenses were not considered, the Washan and the Courtright licenses. And then secondly, one of the Pine Flat licenses has both a direct diversion and storage component, and the direct diversion component was not considered. And an additional deficiency or anomaly, I guess we noticed, but we're not exactly sure how they computed or accounted for losses, but we seem to determine that losses were being double counted in their analysis, and so we mentioned that as well.
And to that point, I believe that you testified that the calculations underlying the analysis were not in this report. Is that correct?
That's correct. The results of the calculations were, but the actual calculation was not. So our alternative analysis started with the Piedra flows and went through this deduction process, tried to recreate what West Yost did so we can understand what they did.
And what is your opinion on a water availability analysis that for a flood project that presents its results in the form of an average yield?
In connection with a flood project?
Sure, a high flow project that presents its conclusions in the form of an average water available every year.
Well, I don't think average is an appropriate way if water is only sporadically available.
Okay, and you prepared a critique of this report, correct?
Yes,
Okay, and your critique is found at Upper River Exhibit 55. Would you like to see it?
yeah, I believe that's correct, but yes.
Okay, let's just confirm that. Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up Upper River Exhibit 55? All right, Mr. Bonsignor, do you recognize this is the first page of the report that you did analyzing and critiquing West Yost's original water availability analysis?
Yes,
And you testified that the water availability analysis showed water available in 18 years.
yes.
Did you prepare a revised water availability analysis? An alternative, I think is how you phrased it.
Yes, we did prepare an alternative analysis that attempted to correct the errors that we found in the original water availability analysis.
And what were the results, the conclusions and analysis that you performed? What did that show?
Well, I mean, and the corrections we made was we did not count losses because we felt they'd been double counted, and we accounted for all 6 of the Kings River licenses, including the ones that West Yost had omitted. So when we did our alternative analysis, we concluded that in the 63-year period of record, water was available only in 5 years of the 63 years. And in terms of averages, we came up with a value of about 5,400 acre feet, as opposed to the 18,500 that West Yost analysis had come up with. I guess one thing I'd like to point out is that neither the West Yost analysis or ours considered the senior right of the Upper River districts. West Yost analysis didn't include it. We were just trying to recreate what they did to try to understand what they did.
Sure. And did your analysis also find that there was a stretch of 19 years in which water would not have been available at all?
Yes. From 1917 back 19 years, whatever that is.
Yeah, 99 to 2017, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And then, do you recall that this report was submitted to the State Water Board and a copy provided to Semi-Tropic?
It was submitted, it was part of a May 29th package, I think, that you submitted to the State Water Board, and I assume Semi-Tropic got it from there.
All right. Now, in July of 2019, Semi-Tropic's consultants submitted a revised water availability analysis, correct?
Yes,
Turning now to Semi-Tropic Exhibit 26. Ms. Mullen, could you please put that on the screen? Okay. And do you recognize this as the first page of the revised water availability analysis?
yes.
Okay. Can you describe the methodology and the conclusions of this analysis?
Sure. So this analysis was, I guess, what I'd call a redo of Westshow's original analysis. At least the portion referred to in here as Attachment A. And so in Attachment A, they omitted consideration of losses, which again, we found to be possibly double counted. And they considered all 6 KRWA licenses, including the ones that had been omitted from their first analysis. And then this analysis used a lower rate of diversion, 1200 CFS instead of 2200 CFS. And based on all these changes, concluded that water would be available in only 5 years of the 63-year study period. The analysis included a couple other scenarios beyond what they called Attachment B and Attachment C, which made assumptions of forfeiture of certain KRWA licenses.
Okay. And has there been a forfeiture of KRWA licenses?
Has there been a forfeiture of KRWA licenses? Was that your question?
Yes.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna object to that. Calls for a legal conclusion.
Overruled.
Mr. Bonsignor, you can answer the question. Has there been a forfeiture of KRWA water licenses?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And so
No,
you chose not to evaluate the hypothetical scenario that hasn't happened, correct?
that's correct.
Okay. And you prepared a report critiquing this revised water availability analysis, correct?
Yes,
All right. Ms. Mullen, could you please show Exhibit 57, Upper River Exhibit 57? All right, and I see a report here, a technical memorandum dated March 4th of 2020. Do you recognize this as your critique of the revised water availability analysis?
yes.
Can you please summarize your key findings from this report?
Yeah, sure. So again, we attempted to, again, recreate Westshow's calculations. And when we ran the Attachment A analysis that they did, we had similar results. We found water available in 5 years out of the 63. In 4 of those years, our results agreed closely with what Westshow's got. There was a difference in one of the years. We don't really know why. And then for comparison purposes, we computed average for the 63-year period. We came up with a value available that would be diverted by Semi-Tropic of about 3,600 acre feet per year. Their value had been about 3,800 CFS per year. But again, this is computing an average when water is available in 5 years out of 63. So it doesn't seem to be meaningful. And further, there was a period of 19 years when water would not have been diverted by semi-tropic in this scenario. We had made some comments in our original water availability analysis that that West Yost original WAA had not considered certain operational considerations in terms of prioritizing flood flows out the North Fork and considerations of channel capacity limitations in the South Fork upstream of their points of diversion. Their revised memorandum didn't address those comments.
Yes, real world considerations, not the paper water rights analysis.
Correct.
Okay. Ms. Boissevain's revised water availability analysis purports to follow the policy for Northern California in-stream flow analyses, correct?
Yes, it's the State Water Board's policy for maintaining in-stream flows in Northern California coastal streams, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's close to the official name.
And
yes. Well, actually, at the time we reviewed these, we didn't know that is what she based it on. That was in her written testimony, but her reference to the policy is not in her memorandums.
Mm-hmm. And is it your understanding that that policy requires consideration of all senior water rights, including senior filed applications?
Yes.
Did Ms. Boissevain's revised water availability analysis consider the senior water right application on file from the Upper River districts?
No.
Is it your understanding that that application seeks up to 1 million acre feet of water?
That is my understanding, yes.
Considering that application, would that have affected her analysis?
I think it would have, and I think she said the same thing. So yes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bonsignor. No further questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bonsignor. Mr. O'Brien or Mr. Bivens, do you have questions for this witness?
Yes, please. Ms. Mullen, could we bring up exhibit UR 053? I believe that's Mr. Bonsignor's written testimony. And if we could scroll to paragraph 34, please. Mr. Bonsignor, the last line of paragraph 34 of your written testimony states, as licenses 11517 and 11521 are valid water rights, the results shown in attachments B and C are based on incomplete analysis and are speculative, and therefore the results are not relevant. Is that your testimony today?
Yes.
And Mr. Bonsignor, what did you do to determine that licenses 11517 and 11521 are valid water rights?
Well, there are licenses that are posted on the State Water Board's website.
And what did you do to determine the opinion you expressed earlier that a forfeiture had not occurred?
I didn't find anything. I didn't look for forfeiture. They're shown on the Water Board's website as valid water rights.
So you didn't investigate, for example, the original reports of licensee that had been filed for these water right licenses?
No, we had some conversations that those reports, that the reporting had probably not been done in accordance with the priorities. So we did have that knowledge that they were probably not correct.
With whom did you have those conversations?
Kevin Johansson with Provost and Pritchard.
Did you have any conversations with Mr. Jacobs about those reports?
Possibly, I don't remember specifically.
Did Mr. Jacobs provide you with any information about the validity of licenses 11517?
Objection, attorney work product.
Goes to his testimony. Goes to the basis of his
Objection.
opinion.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I think we're coming in a little close. Mr. Bivens, maybe you can revise the question or move away from questions about conversations with Mr. Jacobs.
Certainly. I think we can move along. So just to be clear, Mr. Bonsignor, your testimony doesn't evaluate the reports of licensee on which Semi-Tropics revised water availability analysis was based?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I just want to confirm that your testimony does not evaluate the reports of licensee on which Semi-Tropics revised water availability analysis was based.
Objection, misstates his testimony.
Can you revise the question, Mr. Bivens?
Sure. Did your testimony evaluate the reports of licensee on which Semi-Tropics revised water availability analysis was based?
No,
And you don't dispute that the revised water availability analysis accurately characterized the original reports of licensee for the years that it analyzed?
again, we did not do a detailed evaluation of attachments B and C. My understanding is Ms. Boisevane had her interpretation of what she thought should be considered in a forfeiture analysis.
And you've testified that you have experience with appropriative water rights and water availability analyses on the order of about 30 years. Do I have that right?
I'm sorry, you say 30 analyses or 30 years?
30 years.
Yes,
You've done more analyses than that.
probably, yes.
Okay. And given your experience, do you have an understanding as to whether appropriative water rights in California are obtained and maintained based on the beneficial use of water?
Objection, calls for a legal conclusion.
I'm going to overrule the objection, but with the caveat, Mr. Bonsignor, to answer based on your professional experience, not as an attorney.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. Do you have an understanding that appropriative water rights in California are obtained and maintained based on the beneficial use of water?
Well, I think the water right, if you're talking about permits and licenses, are obtained by filing an application and going through the process. And then once those rights are granted, they are maintained by ongoing beneficial use.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsignor. And so if you did not evaluate whether water was put to beneficial use under licenses 11517 and 11521, then you didn't actually evaluate whether those licenses are valid water rights, correct?
I did not do an evaluation of whether they're valid.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bonsignor. If we could scroll up to paragraph 23, please. Mr. Bonsignor, you've stated here that the vast majority of flood flows are routed to the North Fork in accordance with the mandates of federal flood control law and direction from US ACE, Army Corps of Engineers, which render such flows unavailable for diversion at SID's proposed points of diversion. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
Have you reviewed Mr. Haugen's direct testimony in this case?
No.
If we could pull up Ms. Mullen, exhibit KRWA-6, please. And if we could scroll to paragraph 61, please. Mr. Bonsignor, do you agree with Mr. Haugen's statement that KRWA's discussions with its member units and the Corps in a time leading up to a flood release focus heavily on what future irrigation demand is forecast to be?
Objection calls for speculation.
I think actually, Mr. Bivens, will you just repeat the question? I didn't hear the operative part that I understood you to be reading the testimony, so.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you agree, to the extent that you know, that KRWA's discussions with its member units and the Army Corps of Engineers leading up to a flood release focus heavily on what future irrigation demand is forecast to be?
And
Objection calls for speculation.
I note the objection. Mr. Bonsignor, answer if you know, please.
I only know from what I'm reading in this testimony that's up on the page right now.
Okay, and we can go ahead and take this down, please, Ms. Mullen. Mr. Bonsignor, is it your testimony that if the Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District wanted to divert additional Kings River water that would otherwise be flood released to the James Bypass, that the Corps would refuse to allow those diversions?
Objection misstates his testimony.
It's a hypothetical.
If there's an offer of proof, where is this in his testimony?
I'm sorry, the objection is based on.
I'm sorry, I'm not stating his testimony. I'm not characterizing his testimony in any way. I'm asking him a hypothetical question. I'd like to know if it's his opinion that if the Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District wanted to divert additional Kings River water that would otherwise be flood released to the James Bypass, whether the Corps would refuse to allow those diversions. And I think
I'm going to allow the question. I think it's based on the testimony of paragraph 23 that we're looking at. So please, Mr. Bonsignor, if you're able to answer, please go ahead.
I don't know if the Corps would disallow that.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsignor. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Do any of the other parties have questions for Mr. Bonsignor?
Ms. Kinsey, I do have a quick question for Mr. Bonsignor.
I will come back to you. Are there any other parties who would like to ask questions of Mr. Bonsignor? All right, Ms. Miller, please go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up that semi-tropic exhibit 41 and go to page 42? Thank you. And if we could zoom into section A.1.1, the submittal requirements. Thank you. Mr. Bonsignor, under this is the North Thin Stream Flow policy for northern streams in California. And my understanding is Ms. Boisevane conducted what is referred to here as a water supply report, which means she quantified the amount of unappropriate water remaining in stream after senior rights are accounted for, correct?
She used the water supply report methodology to count water, yes.
Thank you. I'm curious, in your critique of Ms. Boisevane's water availability analysis, did you evaluate or consider whether she had done what is described here in prong 2, a cumulative diversion analysis, which looks at the in-stream flow needs of fishery resources?
Well, she did not do that, or it's not in her reports, but you need to keep in mind that the policy is geographically specific to the northern coastal counties, basically the wine country counties. And this is basically a recipe that State Water Board staff requires for new applications in that region. And the progression is that you prepare a water supply report, you submit it to the State Water Board, they review it and accept it, and then they define points downstream where the cumulative diversion analysis should be done. So we typically don't do a CDA until the water supply report's been accepted.
So you have not conducted a CDA at this time?
No.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you. Mr. Wooldridge, do you have any questions for Mr. Bonsignor?
No, I do not.
And I think all of my questions that I noted were already addressed. So with that, thank you, Mr. Bonsignor, for your testimony. I appreciate you being here with us today. And
Welcome.
oh, I'm sorry, I didn't ask whether there was any redirect.
No, there is none. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for your testimony. And with that, I believe that is, am I correct, Mr. Jacobs, that that is the close of the Upper River District's case in chief?
Yes.
Thank you. I would like to take a break before we move your exhibits into evidence and deal with that, just to make sure I have my notes in order. And then we'll handle those exhibits, and then we'll move on to the Tulare Lake Basin case in chief.
Ms. Kenzie?
Yes, Mr.
Ms. Kenzie, this is Leonard Herr. Thank you for the break. I have a court hearing that I'm going to attend to. I'm going to throw caution to the wind and ask Mr. Hughes to cover the interests of KRWA in my absence, but I don't want to alarm anyone if they see I'm not on when you resume things after the break.
Thank you, Mr. Herr, for that note, and we will appreciate having Mr. Hughes' presence. And I see it's 10:14. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll resume at 10:24. I see the wave. Does that mean you're ready? Thank you so much. Welcome back. I have, looks like now 10:25. Thank you for the break. I hope all of you enjoyed it. I was able to put together what my understanding of the Upper River District's exhibits are and the status. I also rearranged my files so I have the right testimony in front of me for our next phase here. So based on my review, Mr. Jacobs, it looks to me like coming out of my June 1st ruling, the proposed testimony and then the related exhibits, UR 1 through 52, and additionally, UR 59 were either excluded through my June 1st ruling or follow from that June 1st ruling. So I wasn't going to propose that you offer them into evidence unless you'd like to offer them into evidence. And then we go through the exclusion process. Mr.
Hearing
Jacobs.
Officer Kenzie, this is Michelle Chester on behalf of the River Districts. I would just request that we include in the record UR 9, 20, and 31, which are maps and acreage of the 3 Upper River Districts, which I don't believe go against anything in your ruling, but rather just provide background information.
Okay, so let's do this. I'll go ahead and ask you if you'd like to offer all of your exhibits into the record. We'll keep doing the process so we're clear. We'll continue the process we have been doing, which is you offer all of them in, and then I'll identify those exclusions. So at this time, Ms. Chester or Mr. Jacobs, would you like to offer exhibits UR 1 through 59 into the evidentiary record for phase 1A at this time?
Yes.
Thank you.
And, excuse me, and 60, 61, and 62.
Those are, yes, thank you. Those are the exhibits 60, 61, and 62 related to Mr. Hess's testimony. Thank you for that addition. I had missed that. And then based on my evidentiary ruling of June 1st and the related exhibits, I will exclude UR 1 through 8, keeping in UR 9, as you noted. Well, let me hear, I should hear your objection.
UR 9 is a map of the Alta Irrigation District and acreage in reference to the other 2 Upper River Districts.
UR 9 is a map, UR 20 and
Is
UR,
also correct.
these are all maps.
Correct.
Are there any objections to moving those exhibits into the record? I believe, Mr. Bivens, you had identified, you included them within your objections, but that may just have been because they're sort of related to the testimony. But I believe UR 9, 20, and 31 were identified as exhibits to which you objected in your submitted yesterday.
Yes, and we would maintain those objections. They don't have anything to do. The location of all of the Upper River Districts and their groundwater basins don't have anything to do with whether water was available for diversion and use under the Tulare Lake licenses and whether those licenses should be revoked. So we'll maintain those objections.
If I may, it is not an identification of the groundwater basins, but merely background information about the districts participating in this proceeding.
And I'm going to accept them as background. So I'm excluding UR 1 through 8, admitting into the evidentiary record for phase 1A UR 9, excluding 10 through 19, admitting UR 20 into the evidentiary record, excluding 21 through 30, admitting UR 31 into the evidentiary record, excluding 32 through 52, admitting UR 53 through 58 into the evidentiary record, excluding UR 59, and admitting UR 60, 61, and 62. Does that accurately reflect your notes, Ms. Chester?
It does.
With that, I believe it is now time for the.
I'm sorry, Ms. Kinsey,
Yes.
before we make that final there, I just want to make sure, one, that our continuing objection to the exhibits associated with the testimony of Damon Hess is noted for the record. I would also move to strike the portions of Mr. Bonsignor's testimony relating to application 38210 purportedly filed by the Upper River Districts, and Mr. Bonsignor's opinions as to how that should have affected Ms. Boyce-Vane's testimony. There is no foundation. There's been no foundation laid for that opinion. And I'll also note that it is entirely inconsistent with the Upper River District's position as outlined in their opening brief that Semi-Tropic doesn't currently have a water rights application pending because of the existence of the FAS declaration. So if Semi-Tropic doesn't have an application pending because of that FAS declaration, then certainly the Upper River Districts did not have a senior application that could have affected Ms. Boyce-Vane's testimony.
Thank you.
Ms. Kinsey, can I respond to that, please?
Yes, Mr. Jacobs.
I think that's a legal argument. I don't think it's an evidentiary objection. The issue of the Upper River application not being considered is found in paragraph 29 of Mr. Bonsignor's testimony, which is Upper River Exhibit 53.
Thank you. So I'm going to note for the record the continuing objection to Mr. Hess's testimony. That's noted. I'm going to overrule the motion to strike portions of Mr. Bonsignor's testimony. I think it goes to the weight of the evidence, not the admissibility. I can certainly wrap my mind around the distinction you made. I think it is a legal type argument and that it would be appropriate to raise in your closing briefs to the extent it's not already addressed in your opening briefs. So thank you. Are there any other objections or issues, procedural issues, before we move on to Tulare Lake Basin's case in chief? Mr. Keel or Ms. Moritzen, please, if you would like to make an opening statement, this would be the time. And then
Good morning, Ms. Kinsey. This is.
Go ahead.
Sorry for interrupting you. Good morning. This is Peter Keel for Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District. We do wish to make an opening statement.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. The purpose of Phase 1A is for the Administrative Hearings Office to consider whether there is evidence of forfeiture or water right noncompliance regarding the Kings River water source under the KRWA water right licenses that are associated with the Tulare Lake bed. Please recall that this proceeding was initially noticed on the Kings River without recognition that other stream systems are tributary to the lake bed. That fact wasn't mentioned in Semi-Tropic's complaint. The party's stipulation that those sources of water are not subject to this revocation proceeding has allowed this hearing to proceed on schedule. However, we've not resolved how these other sources of water may affect any recommendation or determination of the AHO regarding the Kings River sources. The complication, I just wanted to remind folks that we still consider that a very important issue to resolve. The linchpin of Semi-Tropic's case in chief are the old reports of licensee that don't make any sense when examined closely. Please recall that Tulare Lake Basin and KRWA stated in pre-hearing conferences that the old reports were inaccurate and that they're being revised. The simple truth is that KRWA had been reporting incorrectly for so long, and they truly, in good faith, didn't know the nature of the inaccuracies until recently. Tulare Lake Basin's case in chief strives to present focused and accessible testimony about some very complex hydrologic and water management and water right issues. This testimony doesn't argue about what might be. There's no predictive modeling. There's no water right application screening tool. There's no speculation about someone's state of mind using old newspapers. The testimony is about what actually happened in the Tulare Lake bed. Mr. Unruh will testify about the actual water diversion and use, the actual water storage facilities, and the actual real-time flood control operations in and affecting the Tulare Lake bed. Mr. Meyer will testify about the specific terms of the KRWA water right licenses, how compliance with those terms required significant revision in the report to licensee. Mr. Meyer will also discuss his spreadsheet tool that depicts historic operations to provide a better understanding of how water supply and flood operations affected Tulare Lake bed operation. This spreadsheet uses actual flow and storage data. Collectively, their testimony will reinforce KRWA's testimony and its reporting of the beneficial diversion and use under the lake bed licenses. Collectively, their testimony will also demonstrate that regional and local flood control precludes a forfeiture determination based on North Fork Kings River outflows alone. So what are we doing here? We know Semi-Tropic wants a way to open the FAS, which explains its shotgun approach in this hearing. Yesterday, Semi-Tropic's opening statement railed against Mr. Johansson, Mr. Meyer's spreadsheets as impenetrable and declared the need to conduct discovery. But instead of taking the opportunity to ask Mr. Johansson about his impenetrable spreadsheet, Semi-Tropic instead just attacked the credibility of KRWA's witnesses. They also started fishing for any other angle to open the FAS. We heard Semi-Tropic argue Tuesday morning that lake bed interests intended to abandon lake bed storage, citing documents before 1984. But Wednesday afternoon, we heard Semi-Tropic allege that the existing lake bed storage is in an unauthorized location. Tulare Lake Basin is here today to fairly and accurately describe a complex system in order to facilitate the HO's review of Semi-Tropic's complaint. Tulare Lake Basin has faith in the HO's ability to examine the facts and properly apply the law in this proceeding. That's the end of our opening statement. May I introduce our first witness?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Keel.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Mr. Unruh. We're going to change video. While we're doing that, Ms. Mullen, will you please bring up exhibit TLBWSD4?
And once we have Mr. Unruh on camera, on video, we will swear him in.
Open up the bottom.
Good morning, Mr. Unruh.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
So let's
Mr.
pause.
Unruh is exhibit. Oh, sorry.
Let's pause for a moment. I need to swear in Mr. Unruh, and I also am going to ask my team to use the spotlight function on Mr. Unruh so that we will all see his video. Give us just a moment. Oh, we can't spotlight phone numbers. I'm receiving a note. So Mr. Unruh, are you appearing by phone? No, there you are.
No, I have a video.
Great, thank you. And
Video and sound.
yes, and we'll probably change shortly. We may change the name on your video here so it will reflect appropriately on our Zoom transcript. Good morning. Well, it's still morning. Yes. Good morning, Mr. Unruh. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Mr. Keel.
Mr. Unruh, is exhibit TLBWSD4 a true and correct copy of your written testimony?
Yes, it is.
Okay, please
For
commence
the
with a
record,
summary of
can
your
we,
testimony.
for the record, can we please have him state his name and spell it?
Sure. Mark Unruh, M-A-R-K. My last name is U-N-R-U-H.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Unruh, please commence with a summary of your testimony when you're ready.
Okay, what I plan to do is, Mr. Keel noted, I'll hit some highlights of my testimony, and Ms. Mullins, so you know what I'm doing. I plan on using TLB exhibits 5, 6, 7, and 9. Is it at least my plan for the moment? And I'll start off with my first topic, my favorite topic. I get to talk about myself for a little bit, and all of you get to listen. I grew up in Kingsburg, California, not too far down the road here. Went to Kingsburg High, and after I graduated Kingsburg High, I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where I majored in agricultural engineering. After graduating there, I began working for a company called MVP Hydrotech. In that company, we designed and built hydraulic and pneumatic cylinders. Through that company, I got enough experience to actually was able to qualify to get certified or take my PE license as a mechanical engineer. And so I first became registered as a mechanical engineer. After working at Hydrotech, I began employment at FID, or Fresno Irrigation District, as an engineer. While I was there, one of the big projects that I got to work on was the Enterprise Canal Project. That was a large canal project in which surface water was being delivered to the cities of Clovis and Fresno. And that was a fun project. Got to make numerous improvements to the canal structures, the canal system. In 2005, I started working for the J.G. Boswell Company in Corcoran as an engineer. At Boswell, right away, I got to start using civil engineering experience on pump stations, concrete structures, wells, canal lift pumps, tile systems, a variety of projects that we did with J.G. Boswell. While at J.G. Boswell, I was also able to take my civil engineering exam and became registered as a civil engineer as well. One of the big projects I was involved with was the Gates Jones pump station, which I'll be able to show on a map here a little later on. While at Boswell, one of the first things that I got involved with was I got on the board of Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District, which is, I'd like to bring up number 5 at this time. So I'll go in, as that's coming up, I'll go into a little bit about TLB, Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District. It was formed in 1926 with a gross acres of around 190,000, of which 170,000 are irrigable. In a typical year, approximately 120,000 acres are irrigated. All water delivered by the district is used for agricultural purposes. I think has been noted earlier, the TLB is also a member unit of KRWA. TLB manages the water deliveries at Empire number 2. And this exhibit that I'm bringing up here is one to highlight at least the recent, I think this goes back to 2007, cropping patterns in TLB. One of the things to note is that in the dry years, particularly in 13, 14, and 15, there was a dramatic reduction in the acreage that was planted. Most of the acreage in TLB is, almost all of it is annual crops. So we have the ability to expand and contract as the water supply changes. Some of the crops grown are cotton, tomatoes, safflower, and wheat. Now I'd like to bring up TLB number 6. This I'll get into it in just a second. Numerous southern San Joaquin Valley tributaries flow into the Tulare Lake bed, including the Kings River, Kaweah River, Tule River, Deer Creek, White River, Pozo Creek, and the Kern River. The lake bed is the end of the line for all these water sources, except for the Kings River, which has an outlet out the North Fork. And I just like, personally, I think of the lake bed as a bowl, or maybe a better example is more of a saucer plate. So you have the center that's really low, and then the edges are much higher. So everything sort of drains to the center of the lake bed, or this bowl. So on Exhibit 6 here, these are the reclamation districts that are in the Tulare Lake bed. I hope that's clear. One of the things, I'm going to jump around here a little bit, but one of the things that was also added to this map that I want to point out is the Cross Creek Flood Control District, and that's in the upper right portion of this map. It's highlighted there in the beige or tan. And that's important. It's not a reclamation district, it's a flood control district, but if you zoom in, or I don't know that you need to zoom in, but what's highlighted in that area are the cities of Corcoran and also the state prison. So that's very important. That district maintains the levee that protects the city of Corcoran and the state prison. Next, I'd like to bring up number 7, TLB 7. So this map is of the farmland cells. So this map is similar to the other map that was just up. We've taken away the Google Earth background, basically, and the reclamation districts, but these are the cells, the different individual farmland cells that you can see there, and the names that we assign to them. So, for instance, right in the middle there is the basin. You can see that one. In most flood events, cells near the center of the lake bed with the lowest levees were the ones that were flooded first. Since I have this exhibit up, I can skip to some of the conveyance and our dedicated storage as well. But before that, the primary activity in the lake bed is farming. And let me point out that the lake bed landowners, they use these facilities for dual purpose. I'll get into it a little bit here. If we scroll down, let's see, we can almost see it. The southern portion of this map, I don't know if we can scroll down to the southern portion. This is what we call the dedicated storage area, or some people refer to it as the South Wilbur. There's 4 individual dedicated cells there, combined capacity of 150,000 acre feet. As I mentioned earlier, we have this, since it's a bowl, the lake bed is like a bowl. This dedicated storage is sitting on a little bit higher elevation, and we need to pump water into dedicated storage. So some of the points that I have highlighted on there, those red arrows are the different pump stations that we use to pump water into the dedicated storage. And also highlighted, or not highlighted, but shown in the blue lines are some of the conveyance systems that we use in conjunction with those pump stations to move water into storage. Now, earlier I mentioned about the dual purpose. We take those canals and we actually run water backwards or forwards, depending on which way you're looking at it. Water can run both ways in a lot of these systems, depending on which way we're moving water. I got to tell you, that was a kind of a new concept for me when I went to work for the lake bed, for the J.G. Boswell. At FID, the water only flowed one way. But here at J.G. Boswell, it goes both ways. Now, we have, as I described, we have the dedicated storage and we have the farmland storage. And when we get into a flood type situations, there's two scenarios in which we can run out of capacity. So our first scenario is we run out of pumping capacity. We initially want to send everything to dedicated storage to preserve the farmland cells for farming. So as you can see, we have various pump stations, as I mentioned, various conveyance systems. Depending on what's happening and where, will determine what our capacity to pump into dedicated storage is. Our second scenario is we actually run out of space in dedicated storage, and we simply can't put any more in there. They're full. And when that happens, we have to make a decision on where things are going to be flooded on the farmland cells. So a couple examples. 98 was we had a dedicated storage exceedance. We had to flood some farmland cells in 98 because we ran out of storage capacity in our dedicated cells. In 97, we had a pumping capacity problem, exceedance, in which there's simply more water coming into the lake bed than we can handle into dedicated storage through our pumping and conveyance systems, and we had to flood some farm cells. 2017 was a unique year in which we were able to keep pumping into our dedicated storage, and we did have situations that, although they were very short-lived, where water coming into the lake bed exceeded pumping capacity, but we were able to keep farmland cells dry due to the fact that we were pre-irrigating with excess water. So we were a combination of but pre-irrigation, irrigation, and pumping into dedicated storage allowed us to keep things under control in 2017. Next, I'd like to go to exhibit number 9. Okay, as been discussed earlier too, there's flood control projects upstream of the Tulare Lake bed. In particular, there's going to be 4 here that I just briefly talk about. And they were all authorized as part of the Flood Control Act in 1944. And each of these projects, the Pine Flat, Cahuilla, Success, and Isabella, are all part of a master they're an exhibit. They're each an exhibit to a master manual. So the first exhibit is Pine Flat. Let's see, okay, that one's up here now. I'll go into details about Pine Flat Reservoir. It was constructed in completed in 1954 with a capacity of 1 million acre-feet. Primary purpose of the project was flood control and water conservation. I think that's highlighted on page 15 if we scroll to page 15 of this exhibit. There. The purpose of Pine Flat. And then for Pine Flat flows out the North and South Forks, I'd like to go to page 17. I believe that's highlighted as well. Okay. In addition to Pine Flat, we also have Terminus Dam, which was completed in 1961, and today has a capacity of 185,630 acre-feet. One thing I'd like to note on Terminus Dam is that there was additional capacity added in 2004. They actually added what they call fuse gates to that dam and increased the height of the operating pool, or the maximum operating pool, by 21 vertical feet, and added an additional 42,600 acre-feet of storage. Terminus is also provides its purpose is flood control, protection to the Tulare Lake bed, and water conservation. The next dam that's also was authorized well, today it's called Schaefer Dam. When it was built, it was Success Dam. I actually had the pleasure of being at the renaming ceremony when Mr. Schaefer, in his honor, the dam was renamed in his honor. So that was something good to be at. And Lake Success is currently in the first phase of a project in which they're going to raise the dam and increase the reservoir capacity of Success from the current 82,300 acre feet to 110,000 acre feet. The last of the project is Isabel Dam, which is down off the Kern River, and that was completed in 1953 with a storage capacity of 570,000 acre feet. Let's see here. And I think, okay. Next, I'm going to jump into the Boswell Water Department. I don't have an exhibit for this, but I'm going to describe it briefly. As I mentioned, I work for the J.G. Boswell Company. I'm currently the water department manager for the Corcoran Ranch. Excuse me. And the water department for the J.G. Boswell Company is the primary operator in the lake bed for water operations. We, on a daily basis, patrol and monitor the operations in the lake bed. We are in constant communication with the upstream entities, those that are delivering water to us. It's obviously very important, as I mentioned, we're at the end of the line for a lot of these tribs, so we want to make sure the orders are right, they're matching our irrigation demands, and we need to stay on top of that. Our operations are almost continuous throughout the year. The lake bed is unique in that we pre-irrigate for the row crops that we plant. That can happen due to the heavy soils that we have in the lake bed. That happens pretty early, usually around sometime at the beginning of the water year in October. We continue through February with that. And currently we've been planting tomatoes by March that require irrigation. They're transplants that we put in the ground and they require water. And we'll continue doing that until they're processed. In late May or early June is when we typically start our first cotton irrigation. And this year we actually started last week with our first cotton irrigation. And we'll continue that until crops are harvested. One final thing I'd like to say is that the time that I've been at the J.G. Boswell Company, I know we've been talking a lot about flood operations and flood years. Of the 15 years I've been with them, 11 of them have been what I would say average or below average, and we didn't have to deal with any flood flows. It was just 4 of those years that we had to deal with flood flows, if at all. And that concludes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. Unruh.
Thank you, Mr. Unruh. I'll turn to Mr. O'Brien or Mr. Bivens. Do you have questions for this witness?
I do, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Unruh. I'm Kevin O'Brien. I represent Semi-Tropic in this proceeding.
Good morning.
Good morning. You testified you're employed by the J.G. Boswell Company. If it's okay with you, I'm going to refer to that entity as Boswell in my questions. Is that okay?
That's okay. Many people do.
And similarly, you mentioned you're on the board of directors of the Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District. I'll simply refer to that as the district. Is that okay?
The district, or TLB, is what we call it internally.
Right. I'll try to use TLB. Thank you. You testified that there are approximately 190,000 gross acres in TLB, correct?
That's correct.
How many acres of land does Boswell own within TLB?
We are approximately 120,000.
And of that number, how many acres are irrigable?
I've got CID mixed up in there, which is not part of TLB. I have to back that out. We're something less than 120,000.
And of that number of acres, how many are irrigable?
We have about 100,000 acres.
That are irrigable. Are they typically irrigated?
If there's water supplies available, yes, we'll irrigate them.
Ms. Mullen, could you please pull up Mr. Unruh's testimony, TLB 4, paragraph 6, please? You'll see in the third sentence of this paragraph 6, you make the statement that TLB WSD manages Kings River South Fork water deliveries. Do you see that testimony?
Yes.
What do you mean when you use the word manages in this context?
The TLB is in charge, or they manage the Empire number 2. So TLB's personnel are the ones that are making the day-to-day operations at number 2.
Does TLB also manage the various storage facilities located in the lake bed?
No.
And who manages those facilities?
That would be J.G. Boswell, or Boswell.
As a member of the district's or TLB's board of directors, are you involved in this management process of the Empire Weir number 2?
What? I'm not sure I quite understand.
Well, I guess my question is, sir, whether the board of directors of TLB gets involved in decisions relating to how Empire Weir number 2 is going to be operated.
I would say at a high level, at a board level.
At a policy level.
That would be yes.
I'd like to refer to paragraph 9 of this exhibit, Ms. Mullen. You state in that first sentence that because the Tulare Lake bed is the terminus for numerous tributaries, including the Kaweah River distributary channels and the Tule River, the risk of flooding productive farmland always is a significant concern. Is that your testimony?
That's correct.
And is it fair to say that that significant concern is carried forward and is a concern of the TLB Board of Directors in setting policy on the Empire Weir number 2 operations?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, you've stated in your testimony that the risk of flooding productive farmland is always a significant concern. My question is simply whether, in your view, the board of TLB shares that concern.
I believe the board shares a concern of flooding within TLB, flooding farmland within TLB.
Fair enough. And is that concern that you identify also a important consideration for Boswell?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, J.G. Boswell is in the farming business, obviously. And in order to be productive as a business, we need to maintain the farming. And if we have lands that are flooded, we can't farm. And that limits our ability to produce crops and function as a business.
Ms. Mullen, if you could now scroll to paragraph 32 of TLB 4. You, in this paragraph, Mr. Unruh, you talk about what you call dedicated storage facilities, commonly referred to as the South Wilbur storage area. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And I think you said in your direct testimony that another word for those facilities is the, I think you used the term dedicated storage area. Is that right?
That's right.
Ms. Mullen, can you please pull up TLB WSD Exhibit 7? You discussed this briefly in your direct testimony, Mr. Unruh, and I just want to make sure I understand the various facilities that make up this South Wilbur storage area mentioned in your testimony, also known as the dedicated storage area. So I notice at the bottom of this figure, there's several facilities that are designated with the word hacienda. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What are the hacienda facilities?
They're dedicated storage. The mid hacienda that you can see there, that's in the center lower portion of that map, and the west hacienda, they're sort of a second level tier. So that's why there's, if you see there, Mr. O'Brien, there's different pump stations there. We have to pump from the South Wilbur portion of the dedicated storage into those second tier storage compartments.
I see. And when you say we, are you talking about Boswell?
Yes, that's correct. J.G. Boswell, yep.
In your testimony, you state that the current storage capacity of the storage facilities in the South Wilbur storage area is 150,000 acre feet. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And does that include the hacienda facilities?
That's correct. The 150,000 represents the total capacity of those 4 dedicated storage areas that I have listed on the bottom of that map.
And when you say the 4 dedicated storage facilities, just so I'm clear on the nomenclature, can you just identify those?
Sure. The first one is, these are in the parentheses on the description there for each one. The first one is the South Wilbur flood area. The next one would be the East Hacienda flood area, the Mid Hacienda flood area, and the West Hacienda flood area.
Thank you. Approximately how deep are these facilities when they're filled to capacity? And I realize there's probably a range, but can you give me a ballpark idea?
I'd say an average of 4 to 5 feet.
In your opinion, as a civil engineer, would you say that evaporation from these facilities is relatively high in comparison to deeper surface storage facilities or reservoirs?
I think evaporation is based on surface area.
So the answer to my question is what?
I think bodies of water with the same surface area in the same area experience the same level of evaporation regardless of the depth.
Does Boswell or TLB keep track of evaporation losses from these various facilities?
I'm sorry, please say that again.
Sure. Does Boswell or TLB keep track of the evaporation losses from these facilities?
When I say we, Boswell, we monitor the water elevation in the storage cells.
Do you calculate evaporation losses?
No. Well, what we monitor is the elevation is what we're monitoring.
So you don't ever calculate evaporation losses?
I would say we attempt to, but what we primarily use are the elevation numbers.
When you say you attempt to estimate evaporation losses, is there some written analysis of that attempt?
We do have, no, I wouldn't say there's a written analysis, no.
Or a written summary or a written anything?
There's basically back of the envelope calculations.
And where are those calculations kept?
That would be in the water department of the J.G. Boswell Company.
Do you recall the range of evaporation losses that those back of the envelope calculations, as you characterize them, show?
What I recall is it's dependent on the time of the year, the conditions, such as basically how hot it is outside, and the surface area.
Well, let's take the summer months, July, August. What would be a typical evaporation rate during that period?
I would say a range of a half a foot to 1 foot per acre.
Per acre, what's the time reference there?
Per month.
Okay. To your knowledge, has Boswell ever considered increasing the storage capacity of its facilities in the South Wilbur area or adding new facilities?
Can you say that again?
Sure. Has, at least during your time with Boswell, has the company ever considered whether to increase the storage capacity of the South Wilbur facilities over the 150,000 acre feet that you mentioned?
I believe in my testimony, I talk about an increase from 120 to 150.
And when did that occur?
I don't know exactly.
Was it before you got to Boswell?
It was during my time at Boswell, but I can't remember exact what years that happened.
Okay, fair enough. Has there been any discussion within Boswell about increasing the storage capacity above 150?
No, not recently, or not, no, there has not been.
Now, you state in your testimony, and we can pull it up if you'd like, that since you started with Boswell in 2005, you've been through 4 years in which flood releases and uncontrolled stream flows threatened farming operations in the lake bed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And according to your testimony, those years are 2006, 2011, 2017, and 2019, correct?
That's correct.
And when you say years in which flood releases and uncontrolled stream flows threaten farming operations in the Tulare Lake bed, what exactly do you mean by that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. When you use the phrase in your testimony, years in which flood releases and uncontrolled stream flows threaten farming operations in the Tulare Lake bed, what exactly does that mean?
Those would be instances primarily in these years that I'm talking about. These would be when flood releases were done off the Cahuilla system and Success, and they exceeded, those flood releases ultimately reached the lake bed, and they exceeded our irrigation demands at the time. We obviously couldn't, it was more water than we were going to use for irrigation, so we had to do something with that, and at that time we would pump into dedicated storage. And the uncontrolled streams would be, there's no dam upstream, for instance, on Deer Creek or Pozo Creek. So those just arrive when Mother Nature decided to let them arrive.
So in years like the ones you've identified, when the storage capacity of the South Wilbur storage area is reached, the 150,000, what happens to the rest of the water that's coming down the South Fork?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Sure. In these years, we're looking at 2006, 2011, 2017, and 2019. In years like that, where if the storage capacity of the South Wilbur facilities, the 150,000 is reached, what happens to the excess water that's coming down the South Fork?
In those years, we didn't reach capacity of the South Wilbur.
Okay, so you stayed within the 150.
Correct.
Now there's other years, I think you referred to 1997 and 1998 in your testimony, where there's so much water that land within the Tulare Lake bed is actually inundated. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are my examples on the two different scenarios.
Yes.
For when we would have to flood farm cells.
And the last time that happened was 1998. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it also happened in 1997.
Correct.
Now you weren't with Boswell in 1997 and 1998. I take it that you've done some investigation or review as to what happened during those years?
That's correct.
But can you just briefly tell me what that investigation consisted of?
The main part of it is relying on information from other employees that were there at the time. The other is looking at, and preparing for this, as you mentioned, Mr. O'Brien, looking at some of our old records that we have, that we Boswell have.
Okay. So let's take 1997 first. I think you said in your testimony that in that year, the floodwater releases, which were in excess of 2,000 CFS, exceeded the pumping capacity to move floodwater to the dedicated storage facilities. Is that your understanding?
That's correct.
What happened to the excess water? Once you reached the pumping capacity, what happened to the excess water in 1997?
In my testimony, I say a cut was made to the 749 levee, and that excess water went to that farmland cell.
Okay. So it basically flooded that farmland cell. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then what happened to it from there?
Say that again. What happened to what?
You said the levee was cut, the farmland was flooded. What happened to the water after the farmland was flooded?
As the flows receded, we dewatered that section and put it back into production.
Put the land back into production?
Correct.
When you say you dewatered that section, tell me physically what happened.
Yeah, we would use the water to satisfy irrigation demands, or in this case, since we exceeded the pumping capacity, we basically what this in effect did, it was like a shock absorber. So the instantaneous flow that we couldn't handle through the pumping went into the farmland cell. And then given enough time, we could take that water, we could relay that water back into dedicated storage. Not back into, but into dedicated storage.
Into the South Wilbur dedicated storage.
That's correct.
And then in 1998, the situation was a little different, as I understand it. In that year, you actually exceeded the dedicated storage capacity. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at the time, that capacity was 120,000 acre feet.
That's correct.
What happened to the excess water in 1998?
Similar to 97, when except as you noted, we couldn't relay the water into dedicated storage, so we had to use the water for irrigation demands until we dewatered the areas of the farmland cells that were flooded.
So you used some of the water for irrigation demands, and then you dewatered the farmland cells. What happened to the water that was dewatered?
I thought I said it was. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. It was used for to satisfy irrigation demands.
So all of the water that exceeded your dedicated storage capacity was used to meet irrigation demands in 1998. Is that your testimony?
That's correct.
And how do you know that? Are there records that show that?
Yes.
And what if I wanted to look at those records? What would I ask for?
You could ask for our irrigation demands.
Not water used, irrigation demands. I guess my question is whether your records show the actual quantities of water provided to meet irrigation demands.
Yeah, as I think I said and mentioned, you're right, Mr. O'Brien. We do have daily records that show our demands as well as where actual water was being used.
Okay.
When I say we, I'm referring to the Boswell Company.
Yes. Thank you. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that you've looked at some of the earlier years where there was substantial flooding of the Tulare Lake bed. Are you generally familiar with those events?
Which years in particular?
Well, I think 1969, 1978, 1983.
Yes, not so much 78.
Okay, but 69 and 83 were the big flood years, correct?
Correct.
And based on your understanding of what happened in those years, first of all, there was a lot of water in the lake bed in 69, is that correct?
Yes.
What happened to the water in 1969 that was in excess of irrigation demand for that year? Do you know?
Well, I wasn't there. I hadn't even been born yet, but my understanding is similar to what I described in 97 and 98. That it obviously took a little longer, but that water went to use to satisfy irrigation demands.
That must have taken a long time, though, given how much water was in the lake bed, at least based on what we've heard in this hearing. Do you know how long it took to meet irrigation demands? Was that over a multiple year period?
I do not know.
How about 1983? Is it pretty much the same story, or did anything different happen that year?
My understanding in 83, the similar situation. In addition, there was a pump back program.
What is a pump back program?
Water was actually pumped back up the South Fork, out of the lake back up the South Fork into the, I believe it was the North Fork channel.
So it was pumped out of the lake into the North Fork channel, and from there it would have gone into the San Joaquin River system?
I don't know where it went.
Okay. That wasn't done in 1969, as far as you know?
I don't believe so. I don't know. Like I said, I wasn't there on that one.
Fair enough. Based on the current configuration of your South Wilbur system, how long does it take to pump out the 150,000 acre feet of stored water, assuming you're at capacity?
Well, actually, we don't do any pumping to bring water out of storage. We rely on gravity to do that.
Okay. Based on the conveyance capacity then of the ditches and conveyance channels, how long would it take you to run the 150,000 acre feet?
We have let's see, assuming that everything is filled, our capacity to bring stuff out of storage can be upwards of 700 CFS, or 1,400 acre feet a day.
Thank you. Does Boswell keep records on quantities of water that are taken out of the South Wilbur storage facilities?
Yes.
And if I wanted to look at those records, what would I ask for?
I think that the best thing to go off of is the elevation, the storage elevations.
From the ponds?
Yeah, from the dedicated storage, yes.
Yes. Does Boswell occasionally store groundwater in the South Wilbur storage facilities?
Yes.
Can you tell me how that part of the operation works?
It's similar. We use the same conveyance systems, and we pump groundwater into the dedicated storage versus surface water.
How long has that practice been going on?
We've been doing that since, I believe, since I've been there.
How many wells does Boswell own and operate?
Today, I can tell you we're running 61 wells.
And you have the plumbing, if you will, to get groundwater pumped from those 61 wells up into the South Wilbur storage facilities?
Yes.
And is that a typical operation? I guess, let me strike that and rephrase it. Let's take a year like this year to start with. This is obviously a very dry year. How would you utilize your groundwater wells in your overall irrigation system in a year like this? Would you start pumping them early and filling up the ponds, or how would that work?
What we have to do is obviously is some sort of planning. We have a couple things to consider. The cotton irrigation tends to come in peaks. So we'll have to account for the different peaks, the instantaneous demands that we'll have for cotton irrigation. So those kind of dictate what we can do and what we can plant. So we'll take that into account, plus the surface water supplies we have, and kind of put all that together and determine what we can irrigate and how much groundwater we're going to need to supplement.
So the groundwater and the available surface water would be commingled in the South Wilbur storage facilities. Is that right?
You're going to have to be a little more specific on that.
In a year like 2021, which is obviously a dry year, very dry year, where you presumably have limited surface water, you would put a certain amount of groundwater in your South Wilbur facilities, and then also in the same facilities, you'd put whatever surface water might be available. Is that how it works?
2020, in this year, 2021, there will be no surface water put in dedicated storage.
So it'll all be groundwater this year.
That's correct.
Let's take a wetter year like 2017. Presumably you had surface water supplies in 2017?
That's correct.
So how did it work in 2017?
If I recall correctly, in 2017, we had a small portion of groundwater and the vast majority of it was surface water.
So
that ended up in the dedicated storage.
Okay. So in a year like 2017, would you basically back off on your groundwater pumping?
But let me, it just occurred to me. Sorry, Mr. O'Brien.
Sure.
I was wrong. In 2017, I believe in 2017, as I think about it now, I think it was all surface water in dedicated storage.
So in a year like that, you just essentially not pump any groundwater?
In 2017, we were pumping groundwater early in the year, and that's what confused me. We were pumping early in the year, but as I reflected on it, we simply turned off the pumps when we had the surface supply, and we used that to meet demands.
Do you know the approximate pumping capacity of the 61 wells that Boswell operates?
Today, the 61 wells, we have a pumping capacity of approximately 240 CFS.
And has Boswell drilled any new wells in the Tulare Lake Bed area, say over the past 10 years?
Yes.
Approximately how many?
Oh, I'd have to look at that, Mr. O'Brien.
Can you give me just a ballpark? Would it be, you think, more than 10 or?
Um, 2000. I'd say 10 to 20.
In the record keeping that Boswell does that you've previously described for me, does Boswell, and this is in relation to the water stored in the South Wilbur storage facilities, does Boswell separately account for groundwater versus surface water that's in those facilities, or is it all kind of lumped together?
When you say account, what do you mean physically?
No, from a record keeping and a water accounting standpoint. Let me withdraw the question and ask it this way. If I wanted to find out in a particular year how much groundwater was contained in the South Wilbur storage facilities versus surface water, would I be able to do that?
Yes.
How would I go about doing that?
We look at all the sources that are coming in, and then what is being pumped into storage. We basically do a ratio of those sources coming in.
And is that something that's done as a matter of course? Do you normally do that calculation, or would you have to do that as a special calculation?
Well, with respect to groundwater, that rarely occurs.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood your answer.
If I understood your question right, you were talking about the accounting when we're not mixing, or maybe storing both groundwater and surface water at the same time. Is that correct?
Yes, and I guess maybe my question was a bit unclear. I was just trying to get at the question of whether the separate accounting for groundwater versus surface water is something Boswell keeps track of as a matter of normal business practice, or whether to answer that question, you'd have to do special calculations.
I guess what I'm saying is that we would maintain that, but that rarely occurs.
And when you say that rarely occurs, what is that?
The mixture of groundwater and surface water in dedicated storage.
So let me make sure I understand that. So you've talked about a year like 2017 when you had presumably substantial surface water supplies. And I think you told me that in that year, you don't think there was any groundwater put into the South Wilbur facilities, correct?
That's correct. Yes. Initially, I said it was mixed, but then I thought about it, and that did not happen.
Okay. And then we talked about 2021, which is a very dry year where there's, I think you said no surface water. And so all of the water in the storage facilities would be groundwater this year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I guess my question is, in a more normal year, if there is such a thing in California anymore, wouldn't there be situations where you would, where you didn't have enough surface water to meet your entire irrigation demand and you wanted to supplement with groundwater? Wouldn't the groundwater and the surface water go in to the South Woodbridge storage areas?
No,
Why not?
we would manage it based on the timing of the two.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, we would use the groundwater supply as a, well, I may give you maybe a hypothetical situation to help things, but we would use the groundwater supply as sort of a baseline supply, and then anything above that, we would supplement with direct surface water deliveries.
So in that type of year, you wouldn't use the South Wilbur storage facilities?
Probably not.
And the surface water component of that, would that be primarily State Water Project water or something else?
It could be any of the supplies that we have available to us.
And what are those supplies?
Or a combination of, as you mentioned, we have a state water supply. We have supplies off the Kings River system, supplies off the Cahuilla system, and supplies off the Tule system.
Okay. All right, let's change topics. This is my last line of questioning, Ms. Kinsey. Are you generally aware of the fact that holders of water right licenses are required to periodically file what are called reports of licensee?
Today I'm aware of that, yes.
What's your general understanding of the purpose of those reports?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, do you have an understanding of why those reports are filed?
Yes, it's an accounting of the permit that's been issued.
The beneficial use of water under the permit or license? Is that your understanding?
Yes, I must admit, Mr. O'Brien, I'm not an expert on water rights licenses.
Okay, fair enough. Were you involved at all in the preparation of the revised reports of licensee that were filed on May 3rd, 2021 in relation to the two Tulare Lake bed licenses?
Yes.
What was your role in that process?
We were tasked with supplying the water supplies in the dedicated storage or storage, the time frame, I should say, within the lake bed. It was more than the dedicated storage area, as well as accounting for the other surface supplies other than Kings River water.
Ms. Mullen, could I ask you to pull up KRWA 7, which is Mr. Johansson's testimony, paragraph 25? Mr. Johansson, in his testimony stated, I'll just read the pertinent portion. He states that additional data on other sources of water entering the Tulare Lake bed and storage in Tulare Lake bed was obtained from the lake bed interests and included in the revised calculations along with considering the priority of the licenses. This additional data that he's referencing, is that consistent with your understanding of the process that preceded the preparation of the revised reports?
Yes.
And who provided this additional data?
I provided it.
You provided it to Mr. Johansson?
I provided it to Mr. Meyer.
And who's Mr. Meyer?
Mr. Meyer is a consultant that's working with TLB.
So he works for TLB and not Boswell, correct?
That's correct.
What additional data did you provide to Mr. Meyer?
I don't understand.
Well, maybe I'll just take out the word additional and I'll just ask you, what data did you provide to Mr. Meyer in connection with his preparation of the revised reports?
I provided the daily storage information for the lake bed, as well as the daily, or I don't think it was daily, I believe it was monthly surface supplies from the other tributaries.
You say daily storage, that's essentially the daily amount in storage in the various South Wilbur facilities?
Well, I think for the time period we covered, and this is what took a lot of time, was it covered not only the dedicated storage, but any farmland cells.
Okay. So basically all of the water that was ever stored either in the South Wilbur facilities or in farmland cells.
That's correct.
Did you provide Mr. Meyer with any other data?
Can you be more specific?
Well, other than the daily storage information that you just described for the South Wilbur and other farmland cells, do you recall providing Mr. Meyer with any other data?
Well, like for example, the two exhibits I have, I provided him that information, where stuff was located, our facilities.
Did you provide him with any data on actual applied water?
No, I did not.
And as a civil engineer, how do you understand the term applied water?
That would be the water that we apply to the crops.
Does Boswell keep data on the quantities of water applied to crops?
Yes.
How is that data kept? Is it on a field by field basis, or what's the form of that data?
It's on a field by, well, the aggregate can get as small, but it's hard to get into this number without spending quite a bit of time, but we can get down to a field level.
If I wanted to look at that data, what would I ask for?
Well, I'd ask for a lot of time. It will take a while to do that.
Is that data in digital form or is it just paper form?
No, it's not paper form.
Okay. But I could, I mean, well, I'll move on. When you provided the daily storage data to Mr. Meyer, did you segregate out water in storage that was groundwater?
Yes,
And how did you do that?
I believe the data we provided Mr. Meyer did not include groundwater.
So in any year in which Boswell pumped groundwater into the South Wilbur storage facilities, you just omitted that from the data you were providing?
That's correct.
Did Mr. Meyer ever ask for the applied water data?
I think yes, he did in very general terms.
Can you be more specific?
Just general quantities, annual amounts that we would assume for crop usage.
But that sounds, and correct me if you disagree, but that sounds different from the actual applied water data. My question was whether he actually asked you for the applied water data.
No, he did not ask for the actual applied water data, but we have talked about, in general, what the crops demand.
Was he aware that applied water data was kept by Boswell?
I don't know.
So is it fair to say, based on your understanding, that Mr. Meyer took a lead role in preparing the revised reports of licensee?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Sure. Based on your understanding of the process, did Mr. Meyer take the lead role in preparing the revised reports of licensee?
It's my understanding that that he was involved, but I wouldn't say the lead role. I think that was Mr. Johansson.
Okay, fair enough. When you provided the data to Mr. Meyer, did you make any attempt to segregate out water that was lost to the system either through evaporation or seepage or otherwise, or did you just give him the gross numbers?
The daily storage numbers were based on the actual volume on a daily basis. That's what the numbers we had, basically the measurement readings, the staff gauge readings of the storage areas. And the surface water supplies were the numbers of our measurement points coming into the lake bed.
So if hypothetically, if in a particular year, let's take a flood year like 1983, where you had water flooding the lake bed itself, if some of that water hypothetically had been pumped out and not used for irrigation purposes, would your data collection have picked that up, or would you just assume that all the water that was stored either in the lake bed cells or the South Wilbur facilities was put to beneficial use?
Could you rephrase that, Mr. O'Brien?
Sure.
I don't quite understand.
That was not a very good question. I apologize. So I'm just trying to, you've testified previously that you provided Mr. Meyer with data regarding daily storage in both the South Wilbur storage facilities and also any storage that existed in what you call the lake bed cells. Is that correct?
Yes.
So my question is, did you make any attempt to refine those numbers to determine what portion of the water stored was actually used for irrigation purpose?
No, the numbers that I gave Mr. Meyer were the volumes in the storage facilities based on the staff gauge readings.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, if you could pull up KRWA 13, please. And if we could, like you did yesterday, Ms. Mullen, if you could zoom in on the left side of this table for license 0111517. Mr. Johansson testified about this table yesterday, and you may or may not know the answer to this question, Mr. Unruh, but I'm curious about where the column taken from source comes from. Do you know what that means in the context of this table?
I do not. The only thing that's jumping out is the year column.
Fair enough. Okay.
No, it's the only thing I know on that. Sorry.
All right. That's okay. Ms. Kinsey, if I could just have a minute to go through my notes, I think I'm pretty close to being done.
No problem. Take your time.
Just a few more questions, Mr. Unruh. We talked earlier about the groundwater wells that Boswell owns and operates. Would you say that over the past 10 years, the quantities of groundwater pumped by Boswell have increased?
I'm thinking. Let me think about this. I would have to. I don't have that in front of me, Mr. O'Brien. I'd have to check on that.
That's fair. Let me. We could pull up your testimony, paragraph 20. That's TLB 4. And I'll ask you to look at, why don't you read the entire paragraph, but I'd like you to focus in particular on the last sentence.
of 20.
Yes, paragraph 20.
Restrictions on pumping from the Delta in recent years have significantly and adversely affected the reliability of SWP deliveries. According to DWR's final State Water Project Delivery Capacity Report, 2019, the SWP is projected to yield only 58% of contracted Table A amounts, on average, under existing conditions. The district's contract for SWP water would yield 87,471 acre-feet in a year with 100% allocation. Accordingly, the district can only expect an average supply of 50,733 acre-feet under current conditions, or approximately 37,000 acre-feet less than its contract supply. The district contracted for SWP water to reduce the reliance on groundwater pumping. With the reduced SWP reliability, the district landowners will become more reliant on other sources, including groundwater.
So when you made that last statement, that implies to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you anticipate that TLB will, or landowners within TLB will become more reliant on groundwater going forward. Is that a fair summary?
Landowners within the district, yes.
Yes, including Boswell.
That's correct.
Finally, Mr. Unruh, there was some testimony yesterday about, I'll say, conveyance of water through the Bryant Kern Canal during wet years. Did you hear any of that testimony?
I did.
Are you familiar with conveyances of water that may have occurred, and I'm talking about Kings River water now, through the Bryant Kern Canal that has occurred during wet years?
I am.
Can you generally describe for me what that practice is?
With respect to the Kings River?
Correct.
There's a pumping station operated and maintained by Delta Land 770 that's placed, I can't remember who described it, but the location was where the Bryant Kern goes under the Kings River. And in times when there's damaging floodwaters and there's capacity available, pumping has occurred into the Bryant Kern Canal.
When was the last time that occurred?
The damaging floodwaters was in 2017.
And the Kings River water that was pumped into the Bryant Kern Canal, where did it end up in 2017?
I don't know where it ended up in 2017.
Do you know whether any of that water, strike that, are there documents that you're aware of at TLB or Boswell that would help me answer that question?
I don't know. I don't know.
Has Boswell been involved in any transfers of Kings River water to users outside of Kings County?
Can you clarify that?
Has Boswell ever transferred Kings River water to a user who used the water outside Kings County?
Kings County. I'm thinking Mr. O'Brien for Kings County. I don't know. I can't answer that.
If I wanted to look at records that would help me understand the answer to that question, is there any particular records I would want to look at?
I can't answer that.
Okay, fair enough. Mr. Henry, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Do any of the other parties have questions for Mr. Unruh? I think what I'll do, I have a number of questions. I think I'll exercise my prerogative to go first, and then Mr. Woolridge, I'll ask if you have any after that. And please bear with me, Mr. Unruh. I'm going through my notes, but I really appreciate your being here to explain some of these issues. So I will try to ask good questions, but let me know if they don't make sense. The first thing I wanted you to clarify for me, I believe in your testimony, you use the term pre-irrigating or pre-irrigation, and I was wondering if you could explain that to me. What is it and what is it for?
Sure, you bet. So for the row crops, and I'm talking primarily cotton and safflower, and I think I might have mentioned the soils within the lake bed are very heavy clays, what people would consider heavy clays. And they hold water for a very long time. And as you can imagine, the minute they get wet, they're very slick and hard to deal with. So the practice has been is that in advance, we will pre-irrigate those soils to basically fill the profile. And when they get dry enough, hopefully in early March, assuming we don't get too much early rain, although that's, sometimes we're wishing for rain, but sometimes the farmers are hoping there isn't any rain. So we kind of have this struggle internally. But if the conditions are dry enough, they'll go ahead and plant the seed, and that profile is at field capacity, and there's plenty of moisture there to germinate the seed and start bringing it up.
So in a sense, is it the pre-irrigation process? It's, you could almost describe it as a long-term irrigation. You're filling the soil profile, as you called it, to irrigate the seeds once those are, well, irrigate may be the wrong word, so that the water is available to the seeds once they're planted.
That's correct. And we typically start with the heavier soils because they're going to take the longest time to be dry enough so that we can plant them.
Okay.
And then we tend to, okay.
No, you can go ahead and please continue. I didn't mean to cut you off.
And then we go to the, I guess I would say less heavy soils. We kind of have an idea of how we're going to irrigate and what goes first and what goes last.
And then this is just a background. It came to mind, but maybe you can answer this. And if you can't, let me know. I'm thinking about Tulare Lake bed as you described, as a saucer, or a relatively shallow bowl, which at least historically would, I gather, fill up and then evaporate. Is there a particular issue with salts in the soils? Is that also an element of pre-irrigation, or is that entirely separate? I do not have a degree in agriculture in any way. Can you address that at all?
We have, sure. There is an entity that the Tulare Lake Drainage District, which is in the lake bed, and they are responsible for taking in and disposing of tile water. And this tile water comes from subsurface drains that are in certain fields in the lake bed. And that system is basically used to help purge the salts out of the soil profile and dispose of them.
Okay. So moving on to a little bit of a different topic, and I apologize, I'm going to jump around a little bit because my notes are as you were testifying. and some of this may repeat, but would it be fair to say that it's a goal of TLB to avoid flooding the farm cells, I believe you called them, whenever possible?
I would say it's more of a goal of the landowners.
Okay,
But you know, that means we're all in it together. So
yes. And then on the landowner point, I wanted to ask if you know whether the lands, the farm cells that were flooded in 97 and 98, were those lands that were owned by Boswell?
yes, yes,
Were primarily owned by Boswell?
primarily, yes.
And is there any kind of agreement, like an easement agreement or something similar between TLB or KRWA and Boswell for flooding that might occur or for storage of water on the lands?
No, there's no agreement that I'm aware of.
Okay. I have a few more questions about measurement, and some of this may repeat what Mr. O'Brien asked you, and I apologize. I just want to make sure that I'm clear to understand the data that both that Boswell has and that was provided to, I guess that you provided to Mr. Meyer. My understanding is the primary data is elevation data of the dedicated storage reservoirs based on staff gauges in those reservoirs. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And then you mentioned that you did not provide data for groundwater stored in the reservoir. Well, is that right? To Mr. Meyer?
That's correct. That's
So
correct.
Would it be fair to say the data you provided was staff gauge data for the dedicated storage when surface water was stored in the reservoirs?
That's correct.
Okay. And then was there a separation in the data of the different sources of surface water?
Yes, there was.
And what
We
were-
tried our best to separate all of that. We basically went through a process of prorating what was coming in at the time on a daily basis.
And what, if you recall, what were the categories of sources of surface water?
Let's see. Well, so we had the different tributaries: Kings River, Kaweah, Tule, Kern. We also had Pozo Creek, Deer Creek. And then in some years, I can remember this, we actually had enough rain, significant rain, where we actually had, we called it local runoff.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe it was 2006, we had a big rainstorm early in the year, first part of January. And I think we didn't actually have any flows into the lake bed, but we had enough local runoff that we pumped that into storage.
And then SWP water, that's a separate category also, is that right?
Yes, you're correct, yes.
Are there also occasions when, I'm trying to think if this question makes sense. I'll ask it and you can tell me if the question makes sense. But are there occasions when water from sources other than the Kings River is directly diverted for use? So it's by, I suppose it would be by either by TLB or by Boswell, so that the water, it does not get as far as the dedicated storage reservoirs. It's directly diverted for use for irrigation.
Yes, and that's what made things a little complicated for us. if we had multiple sources of water coming in on a given day, and we had both water being pumped into storage and water being used for irrigation or pre-irrigation, we had to go through a process where we prorated everything and determine what, a certain percentage of everything went to irrigation and a certain percentage of it went to storage.
And that data, as I understood it, was not provided to Mr. Meyer.
No, the storage data was.
Yes, the storage data was, but the data regarding direct diversion of surface flows before water made it to storage was not, that you did not provide that to Mr. Meyer.
No, that was provided on a monthly basis. Our direct diversion from other sources.
Okay. Excuse me while I look through my notes here. I think I'm getting to the end. Oh, I had one question. It's to understand the background. With regard to groundwater, you testified that in dry years, the district will pump groundwater and store it in the dedicated storage facilities. Can you just explain to me why that is, to make sure I'm clear? Why does the district do that instead of simply pumping for direct use?
I'll make one clarification that the district does not own, and the district TLB does not own or manage any groundwater wells.
Thank you. Thank you.
All of the groundwater. Okay.
No, and then my question stands. It would be for Boswell. I believe you testified that at times Boswell will pump groundwater and then essentially restore it in the surface water the storage facility. Yes. Why do that?
The main reason is that for the cotton irrigation, we have peaks that we have to meet. So there'll be 3 or 4, maybe 5 irrigations through the season. So we'll have these peaks and valleys as the irrigation is being done. Depending on our cropping, we may not have enough water. We don't have enough pumping capacity to meet the peaks. So we'll have to rely on either surface supplies or some other access to some other water, which could be stored groundwater.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you. I think those are all the questions I have. Thank you, Mr. Unruh. I do want to give Mr. Wooldridge a chance, although I just received a note that he may be having issues with Zoom. There he is, he's here. Mr. Wooldridge, do you have some questions for Mr. Unruh?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead, thank you.
Mr. Unruh, in your written testimony, you said that the water department is responsible for coordinating, I guess, requests and deliveries of surface water. Can you explain?
That's correct.
Can you explain the process for that? How would you go about getting from say, for example, a field that needs water to requesting it to it being delivered from KRWA?
So with speaking from Boswell's perspective, the water department, we have our irrigation schedules. The farmers that we have put together their best estimates of when and where the crops will be irrigated. We compile that information in the water department. We come up with an estimate of what we think the demands are going to be maybe a week, 2 weeks out. From there, we look at our available supplies, and depending on what's needed and what we think is appropriate, we will communicate with either TLB staff or other entities, specifically the Kings County Ditches, which would be People's Ditch Company. We put basically our orders in ahead of time to get that water moving towards the lake bed in time for irrigation.
Okay, and then so when it does eventually get down to Empire Weir number 2, and then I guess is over number 2 is how you guys describe it. How does that water then get to the fields?
Oh, okay. Yes, so we have a series of canals, and as I mentioned earlier, everything's pretty flat. So these canals are pretty big, pretty wide. Everything's pretty slow moving. And these canals, to some degree, act as a little bit of a reservoir, but we have different areas in the lake bed that have a common, I should say, operating level on these canals. And what we'll do is we'll move water from one system to the other, either by gravity or by pumping. And then from there, we get into smaller distribution ditches that actually get onto the fields.
Okay, and then when you guys are diverting this water to storage in the dedicated storage facilities, how does it get down to there?
We use the same systems, or the same larger canal systems, but that will involve more pumping or more lifts. We just move the water further south into the dedicated storage.
And do you request that dedicated storage well ahead of time, or are you looking out months, or how are you figuring that out?
Well, from the Boswell perspective, the dedicated storage is owned and maintained by Boswell. So the water department, internally, we make all those decisions on what we want to do with dedicated storage.
Okay, so do you take input from the fields, or I don't want to say farmers, but from where the irrigation water is needed, and then you somehow project out, how you're going to store that water and then eventually apply it to the fields?
Yeah, we look at cropping patterns on an annual basis and a crop plan to come up with a game plan on dedicated storage. But as far as when we're dealing with flood flows, we don't necessarily know when that's coming. So when those show up, then we have to move those in.
Okay, so do you request water from KRWA specifically to store it, or does it only come in from flood flows?
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand. We make requests through TLB and the other member units for irrigation flows.
Okay. So any water that comes in that is stored in the dedicated storage facilities, is that flood water then?
Well, yeah, flood, and then we also discussed at times it could be groundwater.
Okay. And do you know how you determine the availability of water to be delivered from KRWA through Empire Weir number 2?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I think, as mentioned, there's been talk about the Blue Book on the KRWA, and we're just talking about the Kings River. There's a schedule that's developed, and depending on what the flow is and what day it is, will determine how much each member unit is allocated for that day. And we have an idea of what we can, based on the water year, based on, how much snowpack there is. We can look at various years in the past and get an estimate of what we think we might get as far as entitlement. And that's what we'll use for projections. So we'll use that estimate to kind of guide us on what we think our water supplies are going to be for the upcoming year.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm clear, you estimate availability based on the schedule.
Yes, based on the schedule and the snowpack that's
Okay.
going to be melting off and producing the water that ends up in the reservoir.
Okay. Mm. So I had a question about the deliveries from the state water project, I believe through lateral B. Does that water
Yes.
go into the dedicated storage, or is it directly applied?
We can do both. Water can go, well, let me back up a little bit. State water can be delivered in laterals A and B that are owned and maintained by TLB. And once it gets into our system, it could go into the dedicated storage.
And generally, when are those deliveries?
Generally, the state supplies are made in the summertime to help with peaking. Historically, when there's been a lot more available, we might have done some pre-irrigation with state supplies as well as peaking during the summer. But lately, it's been used primarily for peaking purposes during the summer.
Okay, so June through August?
Yes, that's fair, yeah.
Okay.
This year, we only have a 5% allocation, so it's not going to be that long.
Right. Let's see. I think that's all the questions that I have.
Thank you, Mr. Wooldridge. I will now turn back to Mr. Keel. Do you have any redirect questions for your witness? And if you do you want to do that now or after lunch?
Mr. Unruh, would you like a break?
Sure, sounds good to me.
Please. All right, so let's go ahead and take a break. Before we break, are there any other procedural issues anyone wants to raise? I will remind you that all of us need to log out of Zoom and log back in. So that's so our YouTube channel will work this afternoon. And if you are accessing this hearing on YouTube, there is a different link for the afternoon session. So please be aware of that. So please, everyone, log out and log back in, and let's reconvene at 1:30. We'll make it an even 1:30. So I will see all of you at 1:30.